Welcome now to predication in early Latin. In our previous talks, we have looked at noun phrases and prepositional phrases. Now it is time to move to verbs. The verb is the central part of a clause. Some verbs are transitive, others are intransitive. A transitive verb requires a subject and an object. To find needs someone who does the search and an object that can be found. An intransitive verb only requires a subject. To sleep affects only the person who is resting. We say that transitive verbs have a valency of 2 and intransitive verbs have a valency of 1. A limited set of verbs has a valency of 3, such as to give, which needs a giver, a recipient, and an object given. And there are also verbs with a valency of 0, such as to rain. Now, of course, in English we say it rains with a subject pronoun, but this subject pronoun is only there because of syntactic requirements. It doesn't refer to anything. Now, of course, in Latin, if you say pluit, it rains, it's marked as a third person, but again, that is simply because every finite verb needs a personal ending, and the third person is default. Now, in early Latin, you find an interesting phenomenon, and it's been explained in different ways. You can see a subject pronoun here, lucescit hociam, it is turning light. And hoc looks very much like English it. Now in classical Latin you wouldn't have any pronoun here. You can't really say it rains in classical Latin with an id or a hoc. In early Latin this hoc here has been interpreted in different ways. I think the most likely interpretation is that it's not a proper subject pronoun, not a dummy pronoun like in English, but that it's a deictic pronoun where it points to the sky. It's turning light here now. It's not, in this respect, a dummy pronoun as you find in English. Valency seems like a pretty straightforward concept, and in theory it is, but the practical side isn't always equally simple. Sometimes it's not clear whether a verb is transitive or not. To sing can be used intransitively or transitively, as in to sing a song. In English, an object can't be left out easily, so to sing on its own could be treated as intransitive. In Latin, on the other hand, ellipsis of constituents, understood from context, is extremely common. So it's not equally clear whether canere without expressed object should be treated as intransitive or not. Another complication arises from the fact that some verbs have alternative valency patterns. In English and Latin, to open and apparire are good examples. If I open the door, it follows that the door opens. In the first instance, we have an inanimate subject functioning as agent, and the inanimate object is a patient. In the second instance, the inanimate entity has become the subject. Now you can see exactly the same thing happens in early Latin. We have apperio ostium, I open the door, or apperit ostium, and you can see both exemplified in early Latin in the same playwright in Plautus. So we have apperite hasce ambas foris, direct object, open, imperative, both wings of the door. But we can also say foris apperit, where foris is a subject, the wing of the door opens and someone comes out. Agent and patient are not syntactic functions. Often subject and agent are identical and object and patient match, but it's not always like that. Each and every verb requires certain semantic roles to be filled. Looking at the examples we have seen so far, we can say that sing requires a singer and potentially a song, while to find requires a person finding something and an object found. These semantic roles differ from verb to verb. It would be uneconomical to mark every semantic function differently. Languages typically group a number of minor functions together under macro roles such as agent, patient, recipient, beneficiary, location, and so on. These macro roles seem identical or at least similar across languages. The reason we needed to go into this in so much detail is that it matters for verbs with a valency of 2 or 3. With verbs of a valency of 1, that one constituent will be subject regardless of its semantic function. So, for example, to jump, or in Latin salire, takes an agent subject, while to fall down, or cadere, takes a patient subject. But if the valency of a verb is 2 or higher, the most agentive constituent will be subject, and the constituent most affected by the verb will be direct object. Let us now look at a concrete example, the verb to spray. Let's say we have a boy, a wall, and paint. In this scenario, the boy is the most agentive element, so he will be subject. But what will we choose as direct object? Well, we have a choice. If the boy uses up the paint will be highly affected, so we can say the boy sprayed the paint, object, on the wall. In this case, the wall may or may not be covered fully. But what if the wall is more fully affected? Let's say it's sprayed completely. Then we can say the boy sprayed the wall, object, with paint. In this case, we leave it open whether or not the paint is used up. The same happens in Latin with donare, to give or to present. It'll have an animate subject, and then we have to mark the present and the recipient for case. The recipient can stand in the dative, with the present in the accusative. In this case, the present is marked as fully affected, while the recipient is less affected. This construction can have a human or a divine recipient. The offering can be worldly or religious in nature. But we can also put the recipient in the accusative and mark it as fully affected, in which case the present is in the ablative. Interestingly, in this case, the recipient is always human. Presumably, Romans felt it was irreverent to mark the deity as being highly affected by a human gift. So let's look at an early Latin example, 2 examples, both coming from Plautus, both coming from the same play. These 2 examples are only 120 lines apart. So here we have a master, Amphitero, and he has been given a golden bowl. So, because it's a passive construction, the golden bowl, patera aurea, turns from accusative to nominative, and the recipient is in the dative ero amphitruoni. But the same verb can be combined with a different verb frame, and we have in line 137, quo pacto amphitro sit donis donatus plurumis. So here we have an old accusative, a direct object, turning into a nominative. So here we have the recipient nominative, and the present stays in the ablative, donis plurumis. Now the early Latin text corpus, of course, is limited, and so the pattern that I have mentioned, which we can see throughout Latin in classical and late Latin, is not attested for early Latin. You can say Marcus sacellum Jovi donat. Marcus is dedicating a shrine to Jupiter, where the deity is in the dative. But the construction where the deity is in the accusative is not attested and is presumably excluded. Latin, like English, can passivize verbs, as we've just seen, and in a prototypical passive, 2 things are happening. The original patient object is promoted and becomes a patient subject, and the original agent subject is demoted and either left out entirely or rendered as a prepositional phrase. Let's look at 2 examples. You can say Mary supports Jane, and if you passivize it, it turns into Jane is supported by Mary. And that's pretty much like that in Latin too. Now, the 2 languages also agree in broad semantic and pragmatic terms. For instance, if I passivize a sentence, the new subject has to be at least as strongly affected as the old object. So let's look at my examples on the slides. As I said, if you have Mary and Jane, they are equals. But in this example here, John and the Labour Party, we don't have equals. So it's perfectly fine to say John supports the Labour Party, but the passive, the Labour Party is supported by John, sounds distinctly odd, and that is because they're not equals. The passive would be appropriate only if John can make a substantial contribution, for example if he's a multimillionaire. Latin differs from English in one important respect. Only in Latin can intransitive verbs be passivized. We can see this in my first example, a famous one. Itur in antiquam silvam, from Virgil. This one is a famous example. Literally, one goes, there is going, into the ancient wood. What we have here is demotion of a vague agent. No promotion is possible because it's an intransitive verb. On the other hand, you can also find similar things in Roman comedy, but with different pragmatic functions. So we have in conversation, one man addressing another, he says, Salve, hello, quid agitur, what is being done. Now normally when you say, how do you do in Latin, you say quid agis, what are you doing? But if you want to be a bit more interesting, you can passivize it and say, what's happening, what's being done. And the reply is, statur hic ad hunc modum. Literally, there is standing, one stands here in this way. This is a facetious way of putting it. The normal way would be to say, sto hic ad hunc modum. But we have a passive here to demote the subject, and it's simply done for humorous reasons. There's no further reason for that. In most languages with an active-passive distinction, the passive is considerably rarer than the active, but its exact frequency largely depends on genre. And again, this is true of Latin. The passive is much less common in Plautus and Terence than, for example, in Lucretius. The more formal genres have generally more passives. What you have to remember here is, this is a genre difference. It looks like a diachronic difference because Plautus and Terence are earlier, but it's simply a genre difference. Most passives in Plautus and Terence demote the agent entirely and do not express it in a prepositional phrase with ab. So we get the type Marcus laudatur, no agent expressed, and it's common in Plautus and Terence. That type of passive is equally common in more formal genres, but the passive is overall more common in formal genres because in many cases the agent is still expressed, the type Marcus laudatur a Gaio. This means, essentially, that in less formal genres it's mostly demotion which matters, while in more formal ones it's often the case that promotion is the important element, while demotion is simply a side effect, and we want to keep the agent in some form or shape. But why would promotion be more important in formal texts? Well, the answer seems to be that in formal texts, sentences are generally longer. Comedy typically has short sentences, maybe a main clause and a subordinate clause, but typically it's short sentences. In the classical periodic style, a sentence comprises one main clause and all accompanying events are expressed in subordinate clauses. Such long sentences can become messy and difficult to follow, so Roman authors needed certain strategies in order to keep them clear and neat. One such strategy is to keep the subject identical in main and subordinate clauses if at all possible. And passivization often helps with that. But demotion in such instances is not sought deliberately. It's simply a side effect. And that is why the agentive passive is particularly common in formal texts. It looks like a diachronic difference because agentive passives are much more common in Cicero, in Lucretius, in Caesar. But it's really just a difference of genre. Comedy has short sentences. You don't need agentive passives. That's it on predication. Thank you very much. And as we say in early Latin, gratias vobis ago.